All right, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to our first breakout session of the afternoon. You are in a session called Women's Peace Movement and Tejanos at War, sponsored by the Texas Supreme Court Historical Society and the Texas State Historical Association. So thanks for coming to what promises to be a really interesting session. We have two presenters today. Our first presenter is Dr. Patricia Shields. Dr. Shields is a professor at Texas State University in the Department of Political Science. She's written 4 books and over 70 journal articles and chapters on topics such as women in the military, civil-military relations, peacekeeping operations, women in public administration, Jane Addams' ideas of peace, research methods, military recruitment, and privatization and pragmatism. She has also edited a leading military journal, Armed Forces and Society, for the last 17 years. Patricia's talk is sponsored by the Texas Supreme Court Historical Society. And just a heads up, we're going to go ahead and leave question and answer till the end after both speakers. So if you wouldn't mind holding your questions until then. But for now, please help me welcome Dr. Patricia Shields.
Thank you, Brian, and welcome to this session. James Harkins was one of my students, and he asked me to give a presentation on Texas and the peace movement, and I said, I don't know anything about that. And several months later, he came back and said, well, you can talk about Jane Addams. She lived in the United States, and the United States is in Texas. Texas is in the United States. So this is the book that I wrote, the journal, and that's a picture of me a few steps from the Sea of Galilee talking about peace and the ideas of Jane Addams to the Israeli military. So I'm a political scientist, I'm really not a historian, but I do think ideas from history can have contemporary relevance. But I said, well, in the spirit of this conference, I would look at maybe there was a peace movement in Texas, and I might find it. Well, what do I know? But the president of Baylor calls a peace congress in Baylor and establishes a peace society. So, well, maybe there is a peace movement in Texas. And they invited Benjamin Trueblood, who was one of the foremost people in the Peace Society, and there is the Baylor student paper talking about the peace conference. I also noted that it was co-sponsored by the Texas Federation of Women's Clubs, and one of the most important women in Texas history, Mrs. Percy Pennebaker, spoke at the peace conference. So I have renamed this presentation, The Peace Movement, 1899 to 1917, U.S. and Texas. And you see there's the Hague Peace Conference and the Texas Peace Conference. Now, one thing I want to say about the Texas and U.S. peace movements. They were, you can look at mostly men, one group, mostly women, and Texas was like the child of the national movement. So if you sort of understand the national movement, you kind of understand what happened in Texas. The U.S. peace movement from the 1890s to the beginning of World War I the idea was to establish law and order and bring arbitration to disputes between countries. They used the United States Supreme Court as a model. They said, well, if we only this United States is so big and has all these different states, and for some reason we're able to get along and our disputes are settled by the Supreme Court. So we need to bring this kind of idea to the international scene. Plus, peace is good for business. War is bad for business. Christian values were a really important part. And then there's also the women's social policy agenda that is related to the peace movement. So those are some of the big themes. The first one, the idea of the peace organizations, the peace societies were run by the elites. Here are some people who were considered part of the peace movement: presidents and leaders of business like Carnegie and Ford. Jane Addams was also an important person in the peace movement. So sort of surprised, huh? You think about long hair and people with placards saying peace, peace. Well, no, you have Carnegie, you have Ford, Roosevelt, Taft. There's important peace conferences in The Hague in 1899 and 1907 that was sort of a culmination of this international peace movement, actually. And the point was for them to develop new institutions and legal frameworks that would enable something like the Supreme Court, some way to arbitrate disputes so you didn't have to have bloodshed. So they were involved in multilateral treaties, permanent court of arbitration, formal peace, formal statements of law, formal laws, and the war crimes were identified. The whole idea is replacing war with a way to arbitrate disputes. In 1915 at The Hague, there was a meeting of the first women's peace conference, and there was supposed to be a peace conference in The Hague in 1915 that was going to be the third of the with the men, but there was war. So the women who were trying to create a more peaceful society or had a peace agenda, they met in The Hague and with the idea of let's stop this now, let's do some kind of mediation, and then after the peace conference, groups of women, including Jane Addams, went to the different capitals of the warring nations trying to get them to be involved in mediation. And it was for that she won the Nobel Prize. And then the Women's Peace Conference, there were 14 resolutions, and these are some of the ones that dealt with women. They wanted to begin peace negotiations immediately, to organize a society of nations. So the idea of the United Nations, which I think was pretty much, or something like the United Nations, certainly it wasn't the first time this came up, but it was a formal resolution that there be something like the United Nations. Somehow war is a man's world. Well, they're saying, well, women suffer too, and we should have a place at the table. We should be able to have a vote and participate. So, and that when the war was over, women and women's ideas and concerns should be part of the peace negotiation. Now, the peace movement, and I just want to, there's the formal sort of male peace movement, male leaders. There's also a women's peace movement. And the third one, really, it had to do with the Christianity and the notion of peace in Christianity. So those are kind of the three pillars of the national peace movement. Now, World War I is what I would call an extinction event for the peace movement. That after the United States got into World War I, people who were involved in the peace movement were considered traitors or German sympathizers. Also, because of the Bolshevik Revolution, there was communist sympathizers, and there was also, and if you could be in two places, you could hear about the press in the other breakout session and learn the effect that the press had on suppressing, or basically anyone who's not, if you're not with us, you're against us kind of perspective. Now I'm going to switch and talk a little bit about Jane Addams. Jane Addams was the most prominent woman of her time. And that is a picture of her funeral. I think it's so pretty amazing. There's a mob there. One thing I'd like you to sort of note, because I didn't mean, this is, yeah. Oh, this laser? Okay. Okay, this area right here, just look at it, that's a porch. There's another picture that, so as a frame of reference, that's the porch. She was just a really, really important person in our woman in American history. And why? Well, in terms of the discussion today, she wrote 3 important books on peace. She won the Nobel Peace Prize, and she also established the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom, which is still active today. So those are a few things about her. She traveled in very high circles. She nominated Roosevelt for the Progressive Party for president. She was nominated by Wilson for the Nobel Prize, and she and Herbert Hoover were involved in collecting and distributing food as a humanitarian intervention during and after World War I. Now, she became famous because she introduced the United States to what was known as the settlement movement. She led something called Hull House, which came from England, and it was a response to the problems of industrialization and urbanization in the United States, particularly poverty, health, sanitation, and immigration. Now, Hull House was in Chicago. She established this, it was a communal type community center, I guess. And it was in the middle of an immigrant community in Chicago. And it was really, because Chicago was filled, I think 90% of Chicago at the time was immigrants. And there's a lot of poverty, but there's also a lot of conflict, because they brought the conflict from Europe kind of with them. And so part of what that community center did was kind of a laboratory of conflict resolution. And that's one of the reasons that she moved into the peace movement, was that her understanding of how conflict was resolved in Chicago. She also, the Hull House was a place where, and women could, and it was mostly women residents, not only, they could plan and think and actually philosophize. And at this point, Addams, she wrote 11 books, and she's been recognized as a founder of classical American pragmatism, the feminist pragmatist perspective. So the picture of Hull House, the picture of the funeral, and this is that same place. This is the Hull House was established in 1889, but by 1920 that was a reunion, and that's just a picture of Hull House. So what happened with Jane Addams between 1899 and 1915, she was a celebrated person. Her books were very influential. She was just beloved. But when she got back from the conference in 1915, she gave a speech at Carnegie Hall telling about her experiences traveling around to the different warring states and her visits to hospitals. And when she visited the hospitals, some of the young men told her that they knew they were going to go into battle and use the bayonet. They knew it because they would be given alcohol or laudanum or something like that. And I think the idea, her point was that these brave young men they were concerned about being killed, but also killing. They were moral agents. But the press took it that she was saying they were cowards. And so from that point on, she began to be demeaned, considered a traitor, a communist, and for God's sake, a woman should not have any opinion on international politics. So then by 1935, though, when she died, she again was celebrated as witnessed by that funeral. I want to look at the roots of the women's peace organization and start with looking at, this was a time when women were becoming politically organized. Now, there's differences between the North and the South. In the North, women were organized earlier through the abolition movement and during the Civil War through the Sanitary Commission. But one important thing that was going on sort of below the radar was the women's clubs, which were a phenomenon all throughout the United States, urban, rural. Women got together to get things done. And then also the settlement movement, which Hull House and homes like Hull House spread throughout the country. Now in the South, the peace movement or the women's organizations began with literary clubs. And then these literary clubs sort of spread out to be women's clubs generally. But throughout this, there was always the moral authority of the mother and of the family and of the woman's role in shaping what happened in the family and maybe what happened outside the family. Now, for the Northern women, as I said before, there's abolition and the Sanitary Commission. The Sanitary Commission was in the North. It was a nonprofit organization that dealt with logistics. And it was $20 million budget, and it was really important in getting things like underwear to soldiers, not to mention food and health care. And so the women who organized and who were responsible for the Sanitary Commission said, well, we did all this work for slavery, and we can't even sign a contract. We think things should change. So they were very instrumental in organizations for women in the North. And the North had more urbanization, and it also had more immigration. But there was the strong women's clubs tradition and the settlement movement again. But in the South, you had the literary tradition. There was some urbanization, but there was also a focus on rural poverty. It was clearly something that happened in the upper class. It had to do a lot with volunteerism, and it was a white women's movement. Here, just looking at the founders of the peace movement, looking at Jane Addams and Anna Pennebaker, you can see how they're very similar. Addams founded the settlement movement. Pennebaker was the president of the Texas Federation for Women. Addams was single, but her sister died, and she ended up being responsible for some children. Pennebaker was a widow with 3 children. Addams was an author and a noted speaker. Pennebaker wrote a history of Texas that was used throughout for years and years. And she was obviously a speaker too. Addams ran a nonprofit organization, and I think it's interesting, Pennebaker was a teacher and a principal, so they both were good at administration. Both of them had higher ed, but not in elite schools. They were the early colleges that a woman could go to at that time, and then they were both upper class. So this is the source of the peace movement in Texas. And I think this is just interesting sort of parallels. What did they do at Hull House and what did the women's clubs do? And I don't necessarily want to read all of this, but you can sort of see drama classes, daycare programs, coffee houses, art, Sunday concerts, meeting rooms for organized labor. That was a little different than would be in Texas. College extension courses. Hull House was the first to establish a bath, gymnasium, kitchen. Now, Texas, they were concerned about libraries, and evidently 90% of the libraries throughout Texas were started by the Texas the Texas Federation of Women's Clubs. Playgrounds, school playgrounds, city playgrounds, traveling art museums, literary. I really love this soap and water days. So we all get out and we clean up our cities. And concerts, lectures, see that it's pretty similar between what's going on in the North and the South. And then there's social activism. It moved from soap and water days to saying, let's have clean water, let's have sewers, let's have healthier places to work, make sure that meat market isn't full of germs. Child labor laws, and I think it's really interesting, both were really strong at juvenile courts. Get those kids out of the adult jails. Now, all of this was associated with a maternalist social activism because these women couldn't vote, and yet they wanted to change policy. And the claims that they were responsible and the importance of women and children and how that went beyond necessarily being part of the house led them to look at world peace as something that was good for women and children. So if you sort of look at the system at the time, paternalism created a sphere within which women should be, and it would be home and children. And what happened with this maternalist women's movement was they said, listen, we know how important it is to be clean in our home. Let's move that out and be clean in our cities. And let's think about it's important to have art in our home. We want art and reading in our cities. And so they pushed out the women's sphere into the world of the city in particular. And this was all part of the moral authority of the woman. A lot of these women convinced their husbands, who were important business leaders, maybe, oh, you've got a room that's empty right now. Why can't we start a library in there? Oh, okay, dear. I guess that. So the women were widening that social claim, but only in the world, the sphere that they were part of. And if you look at Jane Addams, her first book on peace, called Newer Ideals of Peace, dealt with local government. So one of the notions of peace that came out of this is that what does peace mean in this? It's not just not war, it's the kind of society we want. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So in a way, if you looked at the women's peace movement, you could see that you want peace in the family, you want a sense of wholeness, of justice in women's sense of caring in your society or in your city. And so the smaller peace symbol is there, and then the natural extension is war is bad for our kids too. So let's move, and we're affected by war, so let's move out that sphere. So here were some of the women have an instinct and some of the arguments for women and peace. Women have an instinctive and rational opposition to war. It's part of who women and children suffer but are not at the table. There needs to be increased participation of women in politics, and this was linked to the suffrage movement, because if we could get women to vote, then a lot of these things would be more likely to happen. Here's just a picture of the peace conference at The Hague, where these kinds of things were discussed, and where probably there's a fruition of the women's peace movement, a high point of the women's peace movement. But as World War I, it caused it to change completely, and the suffrage movement, the leaders in the suffrage movement distanced themselves from the peace movement, and they became very active in the war and in contributing to the war. So that they said, if we are affiliated with the peace movement, there's not going to be suffrage. So we're going to change our perspective here. But I think there was where Jane Addams went, and where the leaders of the peace movement went somewhat, was to engage in humanitarian intervention. So there was famine throughout Europe, and this is where, what I said earlier, Herbert Hoover initiated this food drive for the countries of Europe, and Addams was engaged in that. And here, this is a definition that I've sort of crafted from Addams' ideas, but I think I'll make sense of it here. So peace weaving. Let's talk about the fabric of peace, the fabric of society. Peace is about emphasizing relationships, and these positive relationships are built by working on practical problems, engaging people widely with sympathetic understanding, while recognizing that progress is measured by the welfare of the vulnerable. I think you can see that the women's peace movement kind of fits some of that. Now I'm going to switch a little bit to the Peace Congress at Baylor. Here's a program which I think is pretty interesting. It started out with Mrs. Pennebaker giving a speech, and there was a Hallelujah choir. So you had the religious aspect. Then, and I think this was you had the president of the Businessmen's Club of San Antonio, Nat Washer. You had a United States District Attorney. You had a member of Congress, a Baptist pastor, and the governor of Texas on the program. Now, the governor didn't show up, but the rest of them did. And then there was the Benjamin Trueblood, who you saw his picture. He came from the National Peace Organization. There was a priest and a person from the press. That's a pretty interesting group of people. And here's some of what they said at the Peace Congress. And Mrs. Pennebaker, what the women of America should do is to believe and make other people believe that peace is the best thing for the world, and that arbitration is the best way in the world to settle all differences. Now we go to the businessman. He said, peace is already accepted as an ally to industry, as well as every other civilizing factor. And then the Baptist preacher, if this nation is to be saved from the doom of the proud nations of the olden days, we must learn from the Son of God himself the priceless value of human life. Now I thought that I would also take Samuel Brooks, who was really spearheaded the peace movement in Texas, the president of Baylor. And there was a book called The World's Best Orations. And in the Lone Star edition, his speech at the Texas Teachers Association, The Price of Peace, was considered one of the Texas best speeches. So here's something about what he said. The price of peace to the shame of modern civilization is the cost of war. That's an interesting caveat here. I do not, as a citizen, and I would not underwrite occasion in war, fail to respond to the needs of my country. But I appeal to teachers who study the history of mankind and who teach the rising generations. We have reached a time in the development of the race when diplomacy and arbitration are better than war. So there was that extinction event, World War I, and here's some casualties of the extinction events. 2 UT professors who were associated some way with the peace movement, or somehow, or they unfortunately taught German. So now let's look at the legacy of the peace movement. And if you think about that peace-weaving example, that the women's peace movement, they dealt with relationships, mother-child relationship, kind of one of the most important. But the other is that you work on practical problems. Well, soap and water day is about as practical as you can imagine. You clean up a dirty city somehow. You don't want, so what I think we have there is actually a legacy to the peace movement, and it's hidden in plain sight, and you might see it hidden by all the work that the Texas Federation of Women did, so that we now have great libraries, parks, we have child labor laws, we have school playgrounds, garbage collection. I think that might be a little bit of a stretch, but I also think that it's not a complete stretch. But for Jane Addams, her legacy, and it's a really clear legacy, is the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom, which is very active, has chapters all over the world, has an office at the UN, and was instrumental in UN Resolution 1325, which increased the participation of women in decision-making as it relates to prevention, management, and resolution of conflict, or armed combat. So that's a clear legacy of the women's peace movement generally. But I think for Texas, I went through, because the Texas Federation of Women's Clubs still exists very much. Here's their 2015 magazine, the Texas Club Women, and the Texas Club Women were organized, send the purple card to your legislator. Purple card dealt with family violence. If we can, so peace in the home, peace in the family, that's kind of a legacy or linked, I think, to the notions of peace. And then finally, there it is, here in Austin, the Texas Federation of Club Women. This is their home, whatever. Okay. So, yeah, sure. Are there?
We have any questions? Microphone. 1 second.
I thought it was interesting how when you talked about back with how President Wilson nominated Miss Addams for the Nobel Peace Prize, and yet how with the women's right to vote and all the hostilities that ensued during that time period before women gained their right to vote, and President Wilson was very much against it, and yet then turns around and nominates her. What an unbelievable change in such a short amount of time. So that really stood out to me when you had President Wilson's picture up there. It reminded me of that time period.
Well, she took the resolutions from the 2015 conference and gave them to Wilson. And subsequently, in meetings with Wilson, she saw that copy folded up, and he had taken it from his pocket. So a lot of what especially some of the ideas about the UN, something like the UN, I thought that was. So he had more than he had a personal relationship with her, but she was nominated 91 times by lots and lots of different people. But he was one of them. You can actually go to a website will tell you who nominated and when.
One second, Pat.
Were there women's movements or peace movements on the other side in World War I?
Yes, because
and what
that was an international conference at The Hague, and I think most of the women who were at that conference were European. They came from all over Europe. Jane Addams was engaged in the peace movement in a way, that newer ideals of peace. That book was a response to kind of the peace is good for business perspective, that there's more to peace than it just being good for business. And she was kind of, because she was in a neutral country, she was kind of an obvious person to preside over that meeting. But it was really organized by the Europeans, actually.
You mentioned that a little bit about how the attitudes changed when she got into the peace movement, and all of a sudden she was now a communist and a traitor, et cetera, et cetera. Did what happened to Jane Addams, was it something similar perhaps that happened in Britain with the women's suffrage movement there, where there was a split, and did what happened to Jane Addams and the war delay perhaps the vote for women and all that? I mean, that just put everything on hold, I guess.
Yeah, actually, I don't feel like I know that answer, but it's a really interesting question. The World War I did change a lot of things, for sure. But on the other hand, women did prove themselves as being valuable during World War I, and that was one of some evidence that they should get to the vote, because they took up the slack in industry.
Any other questions?
How did women in the movement nationally and in Texas respond to these charges that they were communists or they were involved in subversive activities?
Well, in a way, I think they changed their tune really quickly and became clear patriots. I mean, Jane Addams was one of the few people who continued to work to seek peace. I mean, I do think that the Treaty of Versailles was really awful, and that some of the ideas that the women had, maybe if it wasn't so punitive at the end of World War I, we wouldn't have had World War II. And a lot of those ideas, if they'd permeated, it would have been better. So it's too bad that the world became black and white. It was, you're either for the war or you're our enemy. She was actually put on a list of the top 100 most dangerous people, and she was at the top of the list, and I think it's because it's ADDAMS. But anyway, and when I got in touch with I think Dr. Seaholm, who wrote an amazing dissertation on the Texas women's clubs, and she was totally unaware that there was any engagement in a peace conference. And this thing she wrote was like 600 pages and just incredible. And she said she was distressed because she had never heard of it. And I think she never heard of it because they didn't want to, you know, we didn't really have a peace conference. We were going to put this away. And how did I find out about this peace conference? Because the proceedings were in Michigan. They weren't in Texas databases. So anyway, did that answer your question?
I think we have time for one more question if we have one. All right, Dr. Patricia Shields.